Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We're getting closer to actual hostilities between the English and the Pequots. We've worked through a lot of the events leading up to the conflict and have met a lot of important people. This week, we'll work through the English attempts at diplomacy on the eve of the Great Conflict. And as we'll see in the coming weeks, as aggression was building all along the Connecticut frontier. They were not working toward diplomacy with the Pequots, but rather with securing allies and/or neutrality among the other native groups. Frankly, the Pequots were trying to exercise diplomacy as well. The big target for both the English and the Pequots was either the all-out assistance from the Narragansetts or neutrality. And this is a tricky time frame to work through because of all the moving pieces. Some of my sources moved chronologically through the narrative itself. Some worked through the growing hostilities first and then worked through the diplomacy after. Others worked through diplomacy and then the hostilities. That's what I want to do. I want to work through the diplomacy aspect as one chunk, one block, because I think it's easier to focus on one area at a time, and once the action begins, then it's going to move pretty quickly. There will be a lot of moving parts, and today's episode is primarily the English activity. There were internal native activities as well. The Pequots will be dealt with here as the counter to the English. There's also actions of some of the disenfranchised Pequot leaders that were operating separately from either the Pequots or the English. And they too were trying to enlist Narragansett support against the Pequots. Just realize as we work through the diplomatic efforts this week that all along the Connecticut frontier there was already much terror and much bloodshed. And while the Massachusetts Bay leaders were figuring out their best move, the Connecticut folks, those most vulnerable to the aggressive actions of the Massachusetts Bay, were absorbing losses and kept in a stand-down mode. What we discussed last week was the second leg of John Endecott's mission into the Connecticut frontier, both parts among the Western Niantics, and then the Pequots themselves were, if measured against the stated goals, failures. Lyon Gardner was right to be mad and call them on a dangerous plan of action. His dissension fell on deaf ears, as the English culprits, his countrymen, were only visiting the area and would not be the direct recipients of the Pequot response, a response which everyone knew was going to come. John Endecott's missions had not achieved the desired effect over the native populations, but he and his men were treated to a hero's welcome back in Boston. John Winthrop downplayed the failures. John Endecott left the colonizers of Connecticut vulnerable. This was not a popular mission to these folks. Within a few months, official grievances would be filed by Plymouth, Saybrook, and contingencies from some of the smaller Connecticut settlements, to no avail within the Massachusetts Bay leadership. So, as the Endecott mission came to a close, there was no longer any ambiguity about English intentions on the part of the Pequots. They began a diplomatic strategy toward the other groups, one of alliance between the natives against the English. This approach had its merits, but also its problems. The biggest regional threat they faced was from their neighbors to the east and traditional enemies, the Narragansetts. The Pequots would also face a tough sell to many of the smaller river tribes as they had subjected them for a long time, and they would have liked nothing more than to curb the Pequot power. Depending on how you look at it, the Pequot tributary system of smaller tribes were either built-in allies or built-in enemies within the larger nation. Many of these groups would defect. The Pequot message was pretty straightforward. Basically, I'll paraphrase as if I'm quoting them, but this is just my words. Once they get us, they'll come for you. In other words, we're the stopgap. Help us to secure the future for all of us. We may be enemies, but we're all natives. We all have a similar outlook on things. We're not trying to annihilate each other. They're the outsiders. They are different. They do not see things as we do, and they will annihilate us all, one by one. They will keep coming in ever-increasing numbers with ever-increasing demands and superior weapons. Now is the time to stop them, but we've got to act together. The Pequot's suggested plan of attack was not an all-out frontal assault, but rather isolated terroristic attacks. As we'll see, this was their tactic. They suggested, quote, firing their houses and killing their cattle and lying in wait for them as they went about their ordinary occasions, end quote. Those tactics would help to inspire a fear that may keep settlers from coming or send some back to Massachusetts Bay. It would help to avoid the confrontations that pitted a fight between bows and arrows and guns. William Hubbard, the Puritan historian, the same guy who wrote that the Pequots had killed John Oldham when everybody knew they didn't, recognized the strength of this argument when he wrote, quote, Machiavel himself could not have insinuated stronger reasons, end quote. He's also the man who will later write the contributions of Roger Williams right out of this narrative. It's imperative that we realize just how influential Roger Williams was here. That's going to be our focus today. But first, it must be recognized that the Narragansetts were faced with a tough decision. They, like William Hubbard, did realize the reality of English aspirations. They did understand the future may not be so rosy for them either. If you're Narragansett leadership right now, you're at a crossroad. This is a watershed moment in the life of your nation. You'd have to choose wisely. And so they were not very quick to reach a decision. The gravity of the options must have been very divisive. Choosing between the Pequots and the English seems like it boiled down to two options. It seems like it boiled down to two options. The far-sighted option of long-term security and national survival, and the near-sighted option of allowing old rivalries to trump new necessities. In other words, if what the Pequots argued was true, and it had its merits, then the best course of action for long-term Narragansett security was to join the offensive against the English. Or you could let the past dictate your future by failing to let go of animosity that had long simmered. That's not an easy choice. It is only in hindsight that one can easily draw a right conclusion in something like this. Most of us see through cloudy lenses. Our biases tend to pigeonhole us into very poor decisions at times. It was at this point that the Massachusetts Bay leadership became acutely aware of the danger of a general native uprising. They could not allow native unity. That's a classic English colonial technique. Keep the natives divided. They enlisted the aid of Roger Williams. That's a seemingly odd choice. He had just recently fled for his life from the magistrates of Massachusetts Bay over the ideals of freedom of conscience and individual property rights. But he recognized the larger threat of native hostilities and, in his watershed moment, chose the far-sighted position of future security rather than the near-sighted slight that he had suffered at the hands of the Puritan leaders. What would you have done if you were Roger Williams? Would you have helped them? That just seems to me that in the heat of the moment, that may not be a very easy answer. It may not be easy to answer wisely. This was a tall order, even for the friend of the Narragansetts, Roger Williams. As we alluded to previously, Canonicus, the elder of the Cossacums, did not trust the English. It was not just the idea of the Pequots. There were two other areas that he was concerned about that he shared with Roger Williams. And I want to read a couple of extended quotes from Karen Ordahl Kupperman, who I've quoted before in this series. But she really helped to capture the mood and the disposition of Canonicus pretty well here, as well as the overall reputation that the English had among the natives. This was part of the uphill battle that Roger Williams would have to face. So upon their meeting, Kupperman says this first, quote, the elder Narragansett sachem, Canonicus, on being approached by Roger Williams about Massachusetts Bay's plans to make war on the Pequots was, quote, very sour, end quote. Williams discovered that Canonicus believed the English had deliberately sent the recent plague among his people. In reply, Williams told him that God alone controlled the plague and all disease, and that he sent it to the English for their sins as well as to the Indians. In fact, God, angry with the English, quote, for lying, stealing, idleness, and uncleanness, the natives' epidemical sins, smote many thousands of us ourselves with general and late mortalities, end quote. Williams referred to the great epidemics of plague, sometimes compounded with fevers, smallpox, and typhus, that swept through England in the middle years of the 1620s and later 1630s, leading to crisis levels of mortality in 1624 and 1638. 1/5 of London's population was swept away in the 1625 plague. Williams was not alone in applying the same interpretation to misfortunes befalling the English as to those affecting Americans. Colonists in America were keenly aware of the epidemics raging in England. In January of 1637, the churches in Massachusetts Bay held a fast for, among other problems, quote, the plague raging exceedingly, end quote. English men and women, imbued with the belief that God's providence could be read in events, scrutinized all events for their revelation of the divine will, and they interpreted adversity as evidence of God's disapproval of their actions. And so we see by this first exchange that Canonicus believed that the plagues that they were enduring were somehow related to the English. Williams had to overcome that obstacle by pointing out that the English too suffered from plagues. But their interaction went farther than that. Again, quoting from Cooperman, she says this, quote, in southern New England, the wampum trade enhanced powerful sacomships among the Narragansetts and the Pequots, and those tribes formed differing relationships with the English who flooded into their territory after 1630. Before and during the English war against the Pequots, Roger Williams, who had just been expelled from Massachusetts Bay for his uncompromising religious position and his refusal to be silenced, became the colony's liaison with the Pequots, main rivals, the Narragansetts. His self-identification was firmly English. Yet, over the years, he would become one of the most sympathetic recorders of American life. He recorded a solemn oration of Canonicus, quote, the old high sachem of the Narragansett Bay, a wise and peaceable prince, end quote. Canonicus said, I have never suffered any wrong to be offered to the English since they landed, nor never will. If the English were equally faithful, he said, then we will live peaceably together. Williams answered that he knew from long experience that the English did not break their word, at which Canonicus took a stick and broke it into 10 pieces, quote, and related 10 instances, laying down a stick to every instance, which gave him cause thus to fear and say, end quote. Williams answered some of the charges, but took the rest to the English leaders, and hoped they would not give cause for the Indians to question their word, end quote. Which this underscores Williams's relationship with Canonicus and the Narragansetts, that they confided in him that they'd already been slighted. And Cooperman goes on in another section, she says, quote, as war approached, Indians on all sides were concerned about European modes of warfare, particularly targeting non-combatants. A group of Pequots approached the English contingent under Lion Gardner at Saybrook in Connecticut and asked first if the English were through fighting. Given a non-committal answer, they then asked, quote, if we did use to kill women and children, end quote. The reply was that the Pequots would find out, quote, hereafter, end quote. At this, the Pequots fell silent for a while, after which they replied with bravado, saying they had killed Englishmen and would kill women and children. Even the English allies were concerned. Roger Williams sent a series of letters to Massachusetts Bay leaders relaying the suggestions of the Narragansetts for bringing down the Pequots. In a letter sent days before the English attack on the Pequots fort in Mystic, Williams mentioned that, quote, it would be pleasing to all natives that women and children be spared, etc., end quote. The American allies understood the unforgiving relentlessness of European war and hoped that, as allies, they might be able to gain a hearing for Indian notions of limited war, end quote. So as the sides are being picked, the natives are starting to recognize just how vicious war against the English would be. And even if they happened to be on the side of the English, they weren't looking to be that vicious towards their enemies. And just a couple of more quotes. One more from Cooperman here, again, highlighting the level of discussion and diplomacy that Roger Williams actually had to use when he was talking to Canonicus. Others also came to realize that from the Americans' point of view, it was the English who seemed to be innately treacherous. William Eyre, who returned to England to fight in the Civil War, found perfidy among the leaders there and contrasted the actions of Christians with the Indians he had known. He said, quote, "I have lived among heathens who have nothing but the light of nature to be their rule, yet they abhor men that break their engagements or commit any dishonest action." End quote. The English had a reputation of not being very trustworthy. And if you'll indulge me with just one more quote, this kind of sums it up. It doesn't justify English actions. It does explain them. And sometimes if we can't justify something or if there's no justice to be had, understanding or explanation can go a long way. And so as a way to kind of defend or explain the English a little bit, Kupferman said this, quote, "The dichotomy we see between the words and the actions of the English in America would not have been apparent to their contemporaries. The rules of warfare and the laws of self-preservation sanctioned behavior that is, to our eyes, wholly unacceptable. The 30 Years' War raged in Europe during much of the period under study here, and the Dutch fought to free themselves of Spanish domination. The English set forth many campaigns to bring Ireland under their control, and English men and women suffered at the hands of their compatriots in the English Civil War of the 1640s. Besieged cities in Ireland, in England during the Civil War, and in Germany in the 30 Years' War were called on to surrender and cut short the danger and hardship of the siege for the soldiers and themselves. As Henry V warned the French town of Harfleur in Shakespeare's Henry V, written in 1599, as the Earl of Essex prepared an expedition to put down Tyrone's rebellion in Ireland, quote, "The gates of mercy shall be all shut up," end quote. If the town's governors did not surrender, Henry warned, they should, quote, "look to see the blind and bloody soldier with foul hand defile the locks of your shrill-shrieking daughters, your fathers taken by the silver beards, and their most revered heads dashed to the walls, your naked infants spitted upon pikes," end quote. That's nice, right? Great imagery. Although the play was set in the 15th century, Shakespeare's contemporaries would have understood this as a description of the costs of war in their time. War was fought according to generally accepted rules, quote, "a kind of contractual etiquette of belligerence," end quote. So the impression of force is simply running amok is false. Yet the kinds of vengeance the rules allowed in certain circumstances seem astonishingly harsh. And of course, the soldiers could not always be controlled. End quote. So again, the English in America were acting as they had experienced war in Europe. Those experiences just happened to be far bloodier than what the natives were used to. And again, don't forget, this whole scenario is playing out right smack in the middle of the Roger Williams controversy and the antinomian controversy involving Anne Hutchinson, William Vane, Stephen Wheelwright, not to mention John Underhill. The folks of Massachusetts Bay really needed something to rally around. They wanted the wampum and fur business, yes, but there are few things in a society that have the power to affect unity like a common outside enemy. That was another benefit of the growing situation. Even over the other English colonies, Massachusetts Bay superiority. So in comes Roger Williams, a friend of the Narragansetts, actually a friend of several native groups. He spoke the language. This was all at great personal risk, however. As Williams himself recorded, quote, "The Lord helped me immediately to put my life into my hand, and scarce acquainting my wife, to ship myself all alone in a poor canoe, and to cut through a stormy wind with great seas, every minute in hazard of life, to the Sachems' house." 3 days and nights my business forced me to lodge and to mix with the bloody Pequot ambassadors, whose hands and arms, methought, reeked with the blood of my countrymen, murdered and massacred by them on Connecticut River, and from whom I could not but nightly look for their bloody knives at my own throat also." End quote. It's interesting that even though he's a friend of the natives, when push comes to shove, he's an Englishman. It was a harrowing trip, to say the least. He did not waste time in going. He did not tell his wife. He spent days among the Narragansett at the same time as the Pequots were there, attempting to enlist Canonicus's help. But the trip was a smashing success. Williams learned many things over and above what the mission required. From a tactical standpoint, he learned about the confidence of the Pequots. This tactical confidence came in two forms or flavors. Well, first of all, the Pequot goal was to defeat the English and enrich themselves in European weaponry. Like the Iroquois in New York State, they found that it was a great equalizer and then some. It was also hard to come by. There were constant moratoriums against selling guns to the natives, lest they use them on Europeans. So that said, their confidence was rooted in two primary areas. The first is that they trusted in their shamans to deliver them. The Pequots believed that they had one living among them that was capable of diving underwater and making holes in their boats. If you recall from a previous episode, the natives had a real fear of their shamans. And the second reason for Pequot confidence, Williams discovered, was because of the Endecott mission. You remember it had failed to kill or capture many natives. It had actually devolved into the destruction of homes and crops. This action, intended to scare and intimidate the natives, actually had the reverse effect. It galvanized the Pequots and the Western Nyantics. And if you recall, those were the tributaries of the Pequots that had attended the Saybrook Conference. That was the event that their main sachem, Sacius, had granted all of his land to John Winthrop Jr. and promised Western Nyantic allegiance to the English. I guess not. These developments made the diplomatic strategy with the Narragansett all that much more important. That union would pose a real threat. If the Narragansetts unified with the Pequots, their tributaries may join in as well. Those groups, unsure of who to side with, may join the larger native cause, especially if they enjoyed early success. Unfortunately, like the efforts of Pontiac or Tecumseh later, these efforts at unification would fail. The various groups would realize the threat way too late. They would lack the vision to unify. They would lack the leadership that could rally the natives to a single cause for mutual survival. To many groups, the English had an early edge. They were seen as the deliverers or the protectors to many people who had felt the wrath of Pequot power. To them, the English did not represent an existential threat, just relief and protection, and a trade partner with massive upside potential. So the initial information alone was helpful, very valuable. If the unification of Pequot and Narragansett was realized, it could be lights out, not just for the outlying settlements across the Connecticut frontier, but the established secure populations of Boston and Plymouth. Don't forget, these groups may have had tense relations, but like many geographical connected societies, whether in good times or bad, and I'm speaking of the Pequots and Narragansetts here, there was a lot of intermarriage and a lot of communication, a lot of intimate connections on a very individual level. Endecott's raids had woken many people up. There were already many lesser Narragansett sachems, you remember, that despised the English. So there was a lot riding on Roger Williams and his ability to act with some measure of diplomacy. This was the environment that he spent 3 days and nights in, among the Pequot ambassadors. It could not have been comfortable. They were confident, and they followed him around and made constant threats to his life. Williams recorded that he went from wigwam to wigwam for 3 days. That had to be very tiring. So Williams was a diplomatic success, however. As well as learning the tactical aspect of the Pequot plan, he secured Narragansett neutrality. That's a big win. The intended goal had been to keep the natives from uniting, and he did it. Mission accomplished. Although it's true, the Pequots had a great argument and logic on their side for native alliances against the English. Roger Williams had had a few strengths going into the negotiations as well, and he used them to his fullest advantage. He had been offered and accepted the task because of his good relations with the natives, so he had that going for him. The Pequots didn't. English power was growing and everybody knew it. He had that going for him. Meanwhile, the Pequots not only are suffering, a devastating population loss due to illness, they also had lost their main sachem not long ago. Amongst the natives, there was a long history of animosity and violence, and all of these were utilized. But I think it was the person of Roger Williams himself that pushed this mission into the win column. His efforts were recognized by John Winthrop Sr. This 3-day trip was only the opening salvo in the negotiations between Massachusetts Bay and the Narragansetts. Roger Williams had success and managed to stave off a Pequot-Narragansett union. Now, as I said, his efforts were recognized, but what did he get? He achieved neutrality, but in the end, the Narragansetts would not be neutral. They would fight with the English. How did that happen? Those are interesting questions. What did he get out of his performance? And how did the Narragansetts ultimately end up fighting on the side of the English? Interesting questions, but they're also questions for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.